Ever feel like you're doing everything right, but the finish line just keeps moving further away? You're putting in 12-hour days while others cruise by on 6, yet they're the ones getting ahead. It's a bitter pill to swallow when your bank account doesn't match your level of exhaustion. But have you ever stopped to wonder if the weight you're carrying isn't actually yours to bear? Why is your mountain of effort only resulting in a molehill of success? You're tired of being tired, waking up with a heavy heart and nothing to show for your grind. Your hard work has become a cage that's burning you out and stealing your future. Effort without strategy isn't a path to wealth, it's a path to total collapse. Today, everything changes because I'm going to show you how to finally stop fighting the thread. There is a law of leverage used by the top 1% that turns your struggle into a streamlined system. However, there is a hidden reason why most people are subconsciously addicted to this struggle, a reason rooted in a burden you didn't even know you were holding, which I will reveal in a moment. This discovery won't just improve your output, it will save your life from the trap of mindless hustle. Before we get to the solution, you need to see the tragic mistake of a man who thought sweat was his only currency. We've all heard the same old tired fairy tale since we were kids. Put your nose to the grindstone, work your tail off, and success follow. But let's be real, if raw effort was the secret, donkeys would be rich. There's a massive difference between moving mountains and just digging a hole. Look around your neighborhood, you'll see incredibly exhausted people pulling double shifts and running on fumes just to stay afloat. Meanwhile, the folks at the top seem to have all the free time. It's not about laziness, it's about who is actually using a lever correctly. But here is the uncomfortable truth. Most of you aren't just working hard, you are carrying psychological weights, stones that don't belong to you, that make every step feel 10 times heavier than it should be. You might feel like you're sprinting on a treadmill that never stops moving. Your hands are calloused, your mind is fried, and your bank account is bone dry. It's a bitter pill to swallow when hard work doesn't even pay the rent. You're swinging a dull axe with everything you've got, but nothing is for. In a moment, I'm going to show you how this dull axe is actually a symptom of a much deeper, invisible burden you've been taught to ignore. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on this productivity trap together. It's time to stop glorifying the sweat and start valuing the strategy. To understand how to break free, you must first witness the tragic downfall of a man who mistook his exhaustion for a trophy, and the one specific habit that finally destroyed it. Thomas was the kind of guy who thought sweat was a golden trophy. He operated an ancient wooden loom that looked more like a torture rack, and every morning he'd dive into his work like he was going into battle. He truly believed that if his muscles weren't screaming, he wasn't really working. He'd throw that shuttle back and forth with a violence that shook the floor, his shoulders knotted and his lower back constantly on fire. But here's the mystery. Thomas wasn't just fighting his machine, he was fighting a ghost, an internal pressure to prove his worth through pain. To Thomas, the deafening clatter was the sound of progress, but he was essentially trying to hammer a screw because he forgot to check the toolbox. He looked down his nose at anyone who dared to stop for a breather, believing that if you weren't panting for air, you were just being lazy. He wore his exhaustion like a badge of honor, bragging about his long hours, never realizing he was just celebrating the fact that his axe was incredibly dull. By sundown, his fingers were raw and his eyes bloodshot. He produced a mountain of fabric, but it was rough and full of knots. What Thomas didn't know, and what most of you don't realize yet, is that there is a specific emotional anchor that keeps people like Thomas trapped in this cycle of useless effort. It's a weight he could have dropped years ago, if he only knew where to look. He convinced himself this was the only way to climb the ladder of success. But then, he'd glance out the window at the workshop across the street, and what he saw there would challenge everything he believed about hard work and the true price of peace. Just a stone's throw away sat Richard's workshop, a place of eerie quiet. While Thomas was making a huge racket, Richard was usually found sipping tea. He'd spend his mornings sketching out intricate patterns on expensive parchment. To any passerby, it looked like the man was just taking it easy on the clock. Thomas couldn't wrap his head around how Richard stayed so remarkably clean, not a speck of dust or a drop of sweat on his brow. But Richard had a secret. He wasn't just weaving fabric. He had mastered the art of letting go of the friction that keeps most people exhausted. He wasn't fighting his machine. He was treating it like a fine-tuned instrument. Richard knew that a sharp mind beats a sore back every single day of the week. At the end of the week, the real kicker was the massive gap in their results. Richard's silk was smooth as butter, and his patterns were fit for a king. He produced half as much fabric as Thomas, but walked away with triple the gold. He'd figured out that high-value design beats high-volume labor every time. What Thomas saw as luck was actually the result of a specific mental boundary Richard had built, one that prevented other people's chaos and stone from entering his workshop. Thomas just grumbled about unfair favoritism while dragging his weary bones back to his loom. He was determined to show Richard that true grit would win the race. But as the big village festival approached, Thomas was about to learn a terrifying lesson: that pushing harder against a weight that isn't yours doesn't make you a hero. It makes you a victim of your own pride. And the moment of his total collapse is closer than he thinks. The big village festival was just around the corner, and Thomas saw his opening. He figured he'd simply double his hours and push his body way past the breaking point. He was convinced that if he just worked twice as hard, he'd finally outpace Richard. But Thomas was making a fatal mistake. He was trying to carry the weight of a whole village's expectations on a frame that was already cracked. He started slamming the shuttle across the loom with a frantic speed. His breath came in ragged gasps, and sweat stung his bloodshot eyes. The old wooden frame groaned, practically screaming for a bit of oil, but Thomas wouldn't listen. He thought sheer velocity was the only thing that mattered. Suddenly, the fine silk threads, pushed way too far, began to snap like dry twigs. Instead of stopping to recalibrate, he just knotted them roughly and kept right on hammering. His grind was literally destroying the very value he was trying so desperately to create. Then, with a sickening crack, the main gear of the loom finally jammed and gave out completely. Weeks of back-breaking labor were ruined in a single afternoon of mindless effort. What Thomas didn't realize is that his machine didn't just break from the work. It broke because it was carrying the stone of his own obsession with being the hardest worker in the room. He stood there in the silence, staring at a pile of useless, tangled wreckage. If you don't learn how to identify the internal cracks in your own life, you are headed for the same total collapse. And the secret to preventing that is something I will reveal in just a few moments. Thomas sat on the cold floor in the dark, surrounded by a mountain of ruined silk. His hands were bloodied, and his spirit was broken by the very machine he tried to master with force. He looked at his calluses and finally realized they weren't trophy. They were scars of a failed strategy. All that noise and fury hadn't bought him success. It had only bought him a ticket to total burnout. It's a tough pill to swallow when you realize that your grind isn't a path to freedom, but the very weight that is crushing you into the ground. He'd been trying to overpower the thread when he should have been mastering the loom. Raw muscle is a terrible substitute for a well-oiled system that does the heavy lifting. But there was something deeper. Thomas realized he was carrying the stone of a false identity. The belief that his value was tied to his suffering. Humbled and feeling like a total amateur, he finally dragged himself across the street. The pride that once kept his head high had vanished. He knocked on Richard's door, not with a grudge, but with a desperate hunger to understand the invisible gears of success. What Richard was about to reveal is the exact lightness blueprint that most people miss, and it starts with a question you've likely never asked yourself. Richard led Thomas over to a loom that looked more like a piece of art than a simple tool. There wasn't a speck of rust or a single splintered edge on the polished wood. While Thomas's machine was a clattering monster that fought him at every turn, this one sat in poised, silent readiness. It was the clear difference between a rusty old bucket and a precision-engineered fountain. You see, Thomas, you've been trying to win a fight against your own equipment, Richard said softly. You think that cranking up the speed is the same thing as making real progress. But speed without smoothness is just a fancy way to create a whole lot of heat, friction, and wasted life. Richard explained that he spends his best hours oiling the gears so the machine can do the heavy lifting for him. He picked up his shuttle, polished until it shone like a mirror. A rough shuttle tears the thread, but a smooth one glides through like a hot knife through butter. You've been swinging a dull axe at a giant oak tree, wondering why your arms are so tired. I spend half my morning sharpening the blade so the tree practically falls on its own. It's about building a system that handles the grunt while you keep your hands clean. When the friction is gone, the fabric weaves itself. Thomas stared at the polished wood, finally realizing that his exhaustion wasn't a badge of honor. It was a choice to ignore the friction. But Thomas was about to learn that the worst kind of friction isn't in a machine. It's the invisible friction of carrying other people's problem, a weight that even the best oiled loom can't survive. And I'll show you how to identify that specific weight next. Richard explained that the first rule of the elite is building a bulletproof system. Most folks act like the engine, burning themselves out to keep things moving. But the smart ones are the mechanics who design the system. If you're the one doing all the heavy lifting, you're just an employee of your own ambition. A real system is like a well-oiled loom. It keeps churning even when you're away grabbing a coffee. But you cannot build a clean system if your hands are full of stone you were never meant to carry. Then there's the secret of the pattern. While 99% of people focus on the sheer quantity of the cloth, making more of the same boring stuff, the top 1% master the complexity of design. Richard pointed out that a single yard of King's-grade design is worth 100 yards of mindless labor. Don't just be a weaver of thread. Be the master of blueprints that others can't even read. Finally, Richard pointed to a single thread, vibrating with a high, nervous hum. If you keep that thread under maximum tension for too long, it's going to snap, Thomas. Your mind is exactly like that silk. It needs strategic rest to keep its strength and shine. A strategic rest isn't laziness. It's the essential maintenance that prevents a total system collapse. These three pillars, systems, mastery, and rest, are the levers that move the world. However, there is one invisible tension that Richard didn't mention yet. A burden so heavy it makes these three principles impossible to follow. And it's the exact reason you haven't been able to apply them yet. Thomas did the unthinkable. He walked away from his machine for 3 whole days. His neighbors whispered that he'd finally lost his marble or just given up the ghost. But he wasn't quitting. He was finally taking the time to sharpen his mental blade. He realized that staring at a broken loom was way less productive than actually fixing it. He spent his time scrubbing every inch of grime off those forgotten wooden gears until the machine stopped groaning and started purring like a cat. But the most important grime he cleaned wasn't on the machine. It was the toxic belief that he had to solve everyone else's problem before he could fix his own workshop. Instead of using his muscles to force progress, he was removing the friction that held it back. It's amazing how much faster you can run once you stop dragging an anchor behind you. Then came the real game changer. He installed a fly shuttle, a bit of automation that meant he didn't have to throw the weight with his own arm. He stopped being the motor and finally stepped into his true role as the master operator. He was finally learning the law of leverage, working on the system, not just stuck inside it. But there was one final tangled thread Thomas had to cut, the one that connects your self-worth to the weights others put on your shoulders. And that's where the real transformation began. Within a single month, the transformation in that workshop was nothing short of miraculous. Thomas was churning out 40% more fabric than he ever did during his grind day. But here's the kicker. He was doing it without breaking a single drop of sweat. By focusing on the machine's efficiency, he had unlocked a level of output muscle could never touch. The fabric itself underwent a radical change, evolving from rough burlap into King's grade. because he was no longer fighting the machine or himself. The weave was flawless. He wasn't just competing on volume, he was dominating the market on pure quality. Every yard he produced now fetched a premium price that made his old earnings look like pocket change. But the most beautiful part, he was clocking out after 6 hours instead of a grueling 12. His back didn't ache, his hands had finally healed, and that spark of joy had returned to his eyes. He'd reclaimed his life by simply refusing to be a slave to unoptimized, stubborn effort. He finally understood that he wasn't just a weaver of thread, he was a weaver of system, and that the strongest system is one where you have finally let go of the stone that were never yours to carry. He had transitioned to the top 1% who trade strategy for wealth, but as the sun sets on Thomas's story, a question remains for you. How much longer will you allow your own loom to stay broken because you're too tired from carrying everyone else's weight? Are you still out there swinging a dull axe against the world every single morning? Most people think exhaustion is a trophy, but it's really just a sign of a bad system. Success doesn't care about your sweat. It cares about the leverage you've managed to build. Stop being proud of how tired you are and start being proud of how efficient you become. You can keep running on that treadmill until your legs give out, or you can step off, grab some oil, and fix the gears of your own life's workshop. But here is the final secret. The reason your loom is so heavy isn't just because of your schedule, it's because you are trying to weave with threads that don't belong to you. The 1% aren't working more hours, they've just built smoother, faster loom by refusing to carry the weights that society, family, and past versions of themselves tried to impose. Take a good hard look at your daily routine. Is there a task you could automate or a habit you need to prune? Remember, it's not the volume of the fabric that matters, but the wisdom behind the weave. What is that one tangled thread you're finally going to fix today? Because if you don't learn how to drop the weight of the stones you're carrying, even the best strategy will eventually snap your spirit. And I'm about to show you the exact toolkit to set yourself free. Thomas finally understood that he wasn't just a simple weaver of thread, he was a weaver of system. He transitioned from the 99% who trade their health for penny to the 1% who trade strategy for wealth. He reclaimed his life by refusing to be a slave to unoptimized, stubborn effort. But Thomas's journey didn't end with a machine. It began with the courage to drop the heavy stones of guilt and expectation that were pinning him to that workshop floor. Many of the stories you hear here aren't just stories. They reflect the invisible weight you may be carrying every day, the tangled threads in your own life's workshop. If you're tired of holding pain, responsibility, and guilt that were never yours, I created a guide to help you do exactly what Thomas did. I call it The Weight of Stones That Are Not Yours. It's for those who want to finally let go, set boundaries, and live with the same lightness Richard enjoyed in his quiet workshop. Inside, you'll find the exact law of leverage needed to stop the mindless grind and start building your empire, one smooth shuttle at a time. And because I know how hard it is to break the habit of the hustle, I'm including 2 essential bonuses when you get your copy today. Bonus 1, Learning to Let Go, to help you identify and drop the stones of others before they snap your spirit. Bonus 2, When Saying No is an Act of Self-Love, the ultimate tool for building the boundaries that keep your loom running without friction. Don't wait for your own total collapse to start oiling the rusty gears of your daily life. Imagine working 6 hours and producing more value than you currently do in a grueling 12. That isn't a pipe dream. It's the inevitable result of a sharp blade and a smooth, polished loom.